First-class cabin is quiet, bathed in soft amber light. A single dad sits in the aisle seat, his son fast asleep. He's returning from a long trip. All he wants is peace. Suddenly, a flight attendant pushes a medical cart through the aisle. A woman follows, clutching her side in agonizing pain. There are no seats with enough legroom for her injury. A few passengers look away, busy with their phones. The single dad stands up without a moment of hesitation. He speaks softly. "You take my seat. You need it more." No one knows this decision moves an entire military base tomorrow. Thomas Hale is 42 years old, a man whose life is measured in duty, discipline, and a quiet, heavy kind of sacrifice. He is a single father, a role he took on fully 3 years ago when the world suddenly lost its color. The day a tragic accident claimed his wife, Sarah. Since then, Thomas has been a ghost of his former self, a retired tactical specialist who traded the adrenaline of the battlefield for the quiet rhythm of school lunches and bedtime stories. His hands, once used to handling high-caliber rifles and navigating complex terrains, are now more accustomed to tying shoelaces and cutting crusts off sandwiches. The transition wasn't easy. The silence of the house in the evening often felt louder than any explosion he'd survived in the desert. But whenever he looked at Ben, he knew his new mission was the most critical one he'd ever been assigned. Beside him sits Ben, his 8-year-old son, who has spent the last year navigating the heavy, suffocating fog of grief. This flight isn't just a trip. It's a hard-earned reward, a sacred promise Thomas made to his son. It's a bridge meant to lead them back to a world where they can smile again. Thomas had promised Ben that if he finished the school year with good grades, despite everything, they would go to the coast, a place where Sarah used to love the sound of the waves. Thomas had saved every single airline mile, every bonus point from years of grueling, soul-crushing work trips just to upgrade these tickets. He wanted Ben to feel like a king, if only for a few hours. He didn't care about the vintage champagne or the gourmet meals for himself. He only wanted to see his son's eyes light up when he touched the soft, hand-stitched leather of the oversized seat. "Dad, is this really where the rich people sit?" Ben had whispered as they boarded, his small fingers tracing the polished wood trim of the console. "Does it turn into a bed, like in the movies?" "Tonight, Ben, it's where the Hale family sits," Thomas had replied, his heart swelling with a rare, painful joy. "And yes, it turns into whatever you want it to be. If you want a bed, it's a bed. If you want a spaceship, it's a spaceship." It was the first time he'd seen his son smile so broadly since the funeral, and for Thomas, that smile was worth more than a decade of first-class travel. As the plane prepares for departure, the cabin fills with the low, expensive hum of luxury. Ben falls asleep almost instantly, his small body finally giving in to the exhaustion of the airport's excitement. His head rests against Thomas's arm, his breathing rhythmic and peaceful. Thomas sighs, leaning back into the plush headrest. He closes his eyes, ready to let the vibration of the engines wash away the stress of the last few years. He thinks of Sarah, imagining her sitting on the other side of Ben, her laughter echoing in the quiet cabin. He feels a rare moment of stillness, a brief truce with the world. But then the atmosphere shifts. The heavy velvet blue curtain, separating first class from the galley, flickers open with a sharp, hurried snap. The sound is like a signal flare, breaking the silence of the cabin. A flight attendant enters the cabin, her face pale, etched with a professional concern that borders on genuine panic. She looks around the cabin, her hands trembling as they rest on the back of a seat. Behind her is a woman, perhaps 35, named Anna. She is struggling, physically and emotionally. Her right leg is encased in a temporary, bulky medical cast, and she's leaning heavily on a crutch that looks far too small for her. Her skin is a translucent gray, beads of cold sweat forming on her forehead from the sheer agonizing effort of moving. The flight attendant stops in the middle of the aisle, her voice trembling as she speaks to the cabin. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt your evening, everyone," she whispers, her eyes darting between the occupied seats with a mixture of hope and deep apology. "We have a critical medical situation. This passenger suffered a severe injury just before boarding. Her assigned seat in economy is at a bulkhead that cannot accommodate her elevated leg without causing further trauma and potential circulation failure. We are fully booked. Is there anyone? She doesn't even finish the sentence before the silence becomes suffocating. The first-class cabin, usually a sanctuary of comfort and prestige, suddenly transforms into a cold theater of calculated avoidance. To Thomas's left, a man in a bespoke Navy suit, a frequent flyer with a diamond status tag, suddenly finds a month-old financial newspaper deeply fascinating. He checks his gold watch twice, his body language making it clear that his time and his luxury are non-negotiable assets. He makes a point of shifting his legs, as if to demonstrate how much he values his own space. Across the aisle, a woman adjusts her noise-canceling headphones, her gaze fixed firmly on the dark, rainy tarmac outside. She pulls her expensive cashmere wrap tighter around her shoulders, as if she could simply wish the suffering woman out of existence. The message is clear. I paid for this peace, and I refuse to let your crisis interrupt it. Thomas looks at Anna. He doesn't just see a passenger in pain. He sees the way her knuckles are white as she grips the crutch. He sees the grit in her teeth, the way she tries to suppress a groan of agony every time the aircraft jolts. In that moment, Thomas's mind flashes back to a sterile, brightly lit hospital corridor 3 years ago. He remembers the feeling of being completely helpless while the person he loved most slipped away. He remembers the sterile smell of disinfectant and the cold indifference of the clock on the wall. He remembers praying for a single person, a nurse, a stranger, anyone, to show a bit of grace when his world was collapsing. The decision doesn't take time to form. It is an instinctual reflex. It's the muscle memory of a man who spent his youth in a uniform that demanded service before self. Thomas knows what this seat cost him. He knows the long nights, the red-eye flights, and the missed dinners it took to earn this moment for his son. But he also knows that some things are worth more than luxury. He knows that his son is watching, even if he's asleep. Ben's soul will know what his father did. He looks down at Ben's peaceful face, then back at the attendant. He unbuckles his seatbelt with a soft, metallic click that seems to vibrate through the entire silent cabin like a gunshot. Thomas reaches over and gently shakes Ben's shoulder. The boy blinks, his eyes wide and confused in the dim, amber light. He looks around, disoriented for a moment. "Ben, buddy," Thomas whispers, his voice low and steady, radiating a calm that he doesn't entirely feel. "Are you okay? We need to move for a bit, okay? It's part of the adventure I told you about. We're going to the Explorer section in the back." Ben rubs his eyes, looking up at his father. He sees the seriousness in Thomas's gaze and nods slowly. He trusts his father implicitly. If Thomas says they are moving to the back of the plane, then the back of the plane is exactly where they are supposed to be. Ben doesn't complain about leaving the big seat. He just takes his father's hand. Thomas stands up, his tall frame momentarily blocking the aisle. He catches the flight attendant's eye and speaks with a quiet authority that makes the man in the Navy suit flinch. "She can have these seats," he says firmly. "Both of them. My son and I will move to the back. We'll find a way to make it work. Just get her settled." The attendant's mouth drops open. She's used to being berated for slow drink service or lukewarm meals, not this level of selflessness. "Sir, you've paid for first class. You used a significant amount of miles for this upgrade. This is a 5-hour flight. You really truly don't have to. We could try to find another solution." "I know I don't," Thomas interrupts with a small, tired smile. "But I understand what it's like to be in pain with nowhere to turn. Please help her sit down before she loses her balance. She's reaching her limit." Anna looks at Thomas, her eyes watery and filled with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. She looks at the small boy standing beside him. I can't take your seat. You have your son with you. He was so happy. Please stay. I'll manage in the back. I'll take some aspirin and try to sleep." Thomas steps into the aisle, guiding Ben behind him, shielding the boy from the judgmental glares of the other passengers who are now watching the scene with uncomfortable curiosity. "I've spent plenty of time in the back of planes, ma'am," Thomas says, his voice carrying a hint of his old military life. "I've spent most of my career in the back of much louder, colder, and more dangerous aircraft than this one. Trust me, we'll be just fine. You need the rest more than we do. Consider it a gift from a fellow traveler. Ben, sensing the gravity of the moment, reaches out and touches Anna's hand gently. It's a small gesture, but it's enough to make the flight attendant's eyes tear up. "It's okay," the boy says softly. "My dad is really good at fixing things. He says being kind is the best kind of brave. And you look like you need to rest your leg." The cabin is frozen. The man with the newspaper finally looks up, his face reddening with a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He avoids Thomas's eyes, suddenly very interested in the safety instruction card. The woman with the headphones lowers them slowly, her expression shifting from cold indifference to a haunting shame. They are watching a regular guy, a man in a faded hoodie, give away the only luxury he had earned in years, all while comforting a child. As Anna is helped into the spacious, reclining seat, she lets out a long, shuddering breath of relief. The tension in her face begins to melt away as her leg is finally supported. Thomas and Ben gather their small carry-on bags and begin the long walk toward the back of the plane. They pass through the curtain into economy, then through the long rows of the main cabin. They walk past rows of sleeping people, past crying infants, all the way to the very last row. They find two middle seats right next to the roaring engines and the constant traffic of the restrooms. It's loud, it's cramped. The air is stale and smells of processed food and disinfectant. The seat doesn't recline more than an inch, and there's no legroom. But as Thomas sits down and Ben climbs into his lap, Thomas feels a strange, heavy sense of peace. He has nothing left to prove to anyone. He looks at his son and realizes that he just gave Ben a better lesson than any first-class experience could have provided. He showed him that a man's worth isn't in where he sits, but in what he stands for. The plane begins to taxi. Outside, the rain streaks across the tiny, scratched oval window of the coach cabin. Thomas looks at his son, who is already drifting back to sleep, his head tucked under Thomas's chin. He has no idea that his act of kindness didn't just help a woman in pain. It had alerted a shadow network of people who don't believe in coincidences. High above the clouds, while the rest of the passengers settle in for their movies, a signal is being sent. It's not through the plane's public Wi-Fi, which is patchy and slow, but via a secure, encrypted satellite uplink. In a windowless room at a secure military facility 300 miles away, a technician watches a screen. The room is hummed with the sound of servers. "Sir, we have a hit on the Hale profile. He's on Flight 412, and he just triggered a priority report from one of our field assets on board. Asset Falcon is reporting an incident." The duty officer leans in, his face hardening. He hasn't heard that name in a long time. "Hale? Thomas Hale? The tactical specialist? I thought he went dark after the 141st was decommissioned. I thought he was out of the game entirely." "He just surrendered his first-class upgrade to an injured passenger," the technician says, scrolling through the real-time data sent by the flight attendant, who, unbeknownst to Thomas, was also a veteran. "The asset says he hasn't lost his edge, or his heart. He's traveling with a minor. Profile confirms it's his son." "Keep a lock on that flight," the officer orders, picking up a red phone, "and alert the colonel. We might have just found the man we need for the Phoenix project. If his character is still this solid under pressure, he's our lead." If you believe that kindness shouldn't wait for a reward, subscribe to follow the moment that will change everything, and leave a comment. Would you have given up your seat? 2 hours into the flight, the hum of the engines becomes a steady, hypnotic drone. The cabin is dark, save for a few reading lights. The lead attendant, the one who had witnessed Thomas's sacrifice, approaches the very back of the plane. She carries a tray of snacks and extra blankets that weren't meant for economy, including a small teddy bear for Ben. She leans in and whispers to Thomas, "The lady in 2A wanted me to give you this. And she also asked me to tell you that the world needs more men like you. She also wanted to make sure your son was comfortable." It's a small piece of paper, a napkin from the first-class cabin. On it, Anna has scribbled a question. "What do you do for a living, Thomas? You carry yourself like someone who knows the weight of a choice. Most people run from responsibility. You ran toward it. Why?" Thomas writes back with a borrowed pen, resting the paper on Ben's backpack. I used to serve in the 141st. I learned that you never leave someone behind. Now I just focus on being the best dad I can be. That's the only rank that matters to me now. My son is my commanding officer." Anna reads the note and looks back toward the rear of the plane. She can't see him through the rows of heads and the heavy curtain, but she can feel the presence of the man. As a high-ranking intelligence officer, she's trained to read people through their actions, not their words. She noticed the way Thomas sat, even in a cramped coach seat with a child in his lap. His back was perfectly straight, his eyes were alert, scanning the cabin with a practiced, calm intensity. It's a look you only find in people who have walked through fire and come out on the other side with their soul intact. She waits until the cabin lights are dimmed for the overnight stretch, and the fasten seatbelt sign dings for the initial descent into the coastal city. She pulls out a secure, encrypted mobile device, a rugged black unit that looks nothing like a consumer smartphone. She taps in a series of complex codes and waits for the three-way biometric authentication to clear. "I found him," she says quietly into the receiver, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind against the fuselage. "The one from the 141st, the one who disappeared after the accident in the valley. He hasn't changed a bit. He's the one who gave up everything for a stranger today, without even knowing who I was or what I could do for him. He's exactly what the report said he was." On the other end of the line, the official stands up, his voice filled with a new urgency. "Are you sure it's Hale? We've been looking for him since he went off the grid 3 years ago. We need his expertise for the new tactical training initiative. The program is failing because the instructors don't have the heart. They're just machines." "It's him," Anna says, her voice gaining a new command-level strength. "He's a single father now. He's retired, or so he thinks. But he's exactly the kind of man we need to lead the new veteran outreach and tactical integration program. He has the heart, and he still has the spine of a lion. He didn't blink when I was in pain. He just acted. He's a natural leader." A series of rapid-fire orders are issued across secure channels. "Get a full bio on Thomas Hale. Trace his current address from the manifest. Alert the transport wing at the nearest naval base. I want a formal greeting ready for tomorrow morning. And I want Marine One cleared for a suburban flight path. We're going to make an impression." Thomas, meanwhile, is busy wrestling with a stubborn overhead bin to get Ben's backpack as the plane reaches the gate. He's tired, his back aches from the cramped seat, and he's worried about the long line at the taxi stand. He's thinking about getting Ben a decent meal before bed, maybe a burger at the airport diner. He has no idea that a silent, massive machinery of global power has been triggered by the simple act of standing up from a leather chair. As they walk through the crowded terminal, Thomas feels a strange sensation, the prickling feeling of being watched from the shadows. He scans the crowd, his old instincts flaring for a split second, his eyes catching the glint of a lens or a suit that fits too perfectly. But he brushes it off. "You're just tired, Thomas," he tells himself. "You're just a dad now. The war's over. There are no more snipers in the rafters." He puts his arm around Ben and walks out into the cool night air, completely unaware that by sunrise the sky above his quiet suburban home is about to be filled with the sound of military thunder. In the back of a black sedan waiting at the curb, Anna watches him leave. She sees him lift Ben into the back of a yellow cab. She taps her phone. "Proceed with the activation. Let's see if Thomas Hale is ready to come home. Let's see if he remembers the call of duty." The next morning is a typical, chaotic Tuesday. The house is filled with the smell of slightly burnt toast and the sound of a morning news broadcast. Thomas is standing in the kitchen, packing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich into Ben's lunchbox, debating whether to add an extra juice box. He's wearing an old college t-shirt, his hair unbrushed. His phone has been buzzing on the counter for 10 minutes, but he's ignoring it, assuming it's just more telemarketers or his old insurance agent. He walks Ben out to the driveway to head to school. It's a quiet, leafy street where the most exciting thing that happens is a stray dog or a neighbor's new lawnmower. Suddenly, the birds in the trees go silent. The neighborhood dogs start barking in a frantic, unified chorus. A sleek, black SUV pulls up to the curb with surgical precision. It doesn't have a license plate, just a gold government seal on the door. A man in a crisp, dark suit and mirrored sunglasses steps out. He walks toward Thomas with a measured, rhythmic gait that screams special operations. "Thomas Hale?" the officer asks. It's not a question, it's a confirmation. Thomas steps in front of Ben, his body instinctively tensing, his weight shifting to the balls of his feet. He feels the adrenaline hit his system for the first time in years. "Who wants to know? And why are you blocking my driveway? My son is late for school." "Sir, please look up," the officer says, pointing toward the eastern horizon. From the east, a low, rhythmic thumping sound begins to vibrate the windows of the houses. It's a sound Thomas recognizes in his very marrow. It's the heavy dual-rotor beat of a high-performance military transport, accompanied by the higher whine of escort birds. Then appearing over the tree line, the distinctive white top of Marine One comes into view, flanked by two Blackhawks. The wind from the massive blades begins to whip through the suburban street, sending trash cans rolling and autumn leaves flying in a violent whirlwind. The neighbors are pouring out onto their porches, eyes wide, filming the scene with their phones in stunned disbelief. It's a scene out of a blockbuster movie happening on Maple Street. Ben grips Thomas's hand so hard his knuckles are white, his eyes rounding into perfect circles of wonder. "Daddy, is that for us? Did the big bird come back for the seat? Like you said, an adventure?" Thomas is speechless. He looks at the officer, then back at the helicopter as it begins to hover over the neighborhood park just across the street. He realizes now that Anna wasn't just an injured passenger. She was a test of character. He remembers the napkin, the question about his rank. "She wanted to thank you personally," the officer says, opening the door of the SUV with a formal bow. "And she wanted to make sure you knew that your country hasn't forgotten the man you are, nor the sacrifices you've made, both then and now. Please, Mr. Hale, the commander is waiting and your son is invited to see the cockpit." The helicopter touches down in a nearby clearing, the dust settling into a golden haze as the rotors slow to a rhythmic hum. The door opens and a folding staircase descends. Anna steps down. She isn't wearing the hospital gown or the exhausted expression from the flight. She is in a formal, high-ranking dress uniform, her chest covered in medals that glint like stars in the morning sun. She still has the cast on her leg, but she stands with a terrifying, beautiful poise, supported by a young lieutenant. She walks toward Thomas. The entire neighborhood is watching from behind the police tape that appeared out of nowhere. "You gave up a first-class seat for a stranger, Thomas," Anna says, her voice echoing with both the authority of a general and the warmth of a friend. "But more importantly, you showed my team that the values we fight for still exist in the world outside the battlefield. You didn't do it for the miles. You didn't do it for the fame. You did it because it was the only right thing to do. That's true leadership." Thomas stands there, a simple dad in a faded t-shirt holding a child's lunchbox. "I just wanted you to be able to breathe, ma'am. I didn't know you were this. I didn't know you were the one who gives the orders." Anna smiles. "It wasn't just a seat, Thomas. It was a beacon. We've been looking for a new director for the National Veteran Integration Initiative, someone who actually cares about the human beings behind the service numbers. Not just the budget. I think I found him in the back of a Boeing 747 sitting next to a restroom. There are no giant checks, no hollow trophies, just a firm, lingering handshake in the profound, silent respect of one leader to another." Anna hands Ben a small gold coin, a commander's challenge coin. "Keep this, Ben. Your dad is a very important man." Ben looks up at his father, his face beaming with a pride that no first-class seat could ever buy. He sees his dad not just as the man who makes PB and J sandwiches, but as a hero recognized by the highest powers in the land. He realizes that his dad was right. Being kind is the bravest thing you can do. As Marine One takes off again, its shadow sweeping over the small house, the street returns to a stunned silence. But for Thomas and Ben, the world has expanded. A single act of kindness had reached all the way to the highest office and back down to a quiet suburban driveway. Thomas looks at his son, then at the lunchbox in his hand. He realizes that his life of service isn't over. It's just beginning a new chapter. If you believe that a small act of kindness can create a massive wave, subscribe for more stories and leave a comment. Have you ever done something good without expecting anything back? What's the most first-class thing you've ever seen a stranger do?